That's it for housekeeping. Let's go ahead and get today's discussion started with a good old Honeycomb tradition, boop. So hi, I'm Liz Fong-Jones. I'm the field CTO at Honeycomb, and I would like to invite Fred. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Fred Hebert, site reliability engineer here at Honeycomb. So I was involved in the incidents we're discussing today. I've been here for 2 years now, and I'm glad to be talking about incidents all the time with people here. I'm going to bump it to Vanessa. It's your turn.
Thank you, Fred. Hi, I'm Vanessa Huerta Granda. I'm a solutions engineer at Jeli.io. Today is actually my second Jeliversary. I've been here for 2 years. And I just love incidents, fighting them, learning from them. And I've worked closely with Fred and Liz and the entire Honeycomb team with helping you all learn from incidents. Emily, your turn.
Hi, I'm Emily Ruppe. I work with Jeli. I'm a solutions engineer there. Kind of like to say that I am a recovering incident commander. It's been 1.5 years now. I feel like I should be recovered, but maybe not a little bit. And yeah, really excited to chat incidents with everyone. V and I get to live the dream of just talking to people about their incidents all day. So excited to do this with Fred and Lynn.
Wonderful. So today we're going to be talking about a recent incident that we had that we actually published a blog post about. But we want to do this kind of in 2 ways. We want to talk about what the experience was like when we were trying to figure out what was going on and how we debugged that with Honeycomb. And then after that, we'll talk about how we analyzed it with Jeli and kind of managed to learn the most that we could from the incident.
All right, and the incident is not the most recent one we've had because we always have near misses, but it was one of the most recent ones we had a public review on, so people might be a little bit familiar. But it's also one of the most interesting ones we've had in recent memory, just because it has interesting dynamics. It lasted a long time. It was extremely exhausting for everyone involved. And if you end up going to that blog post, the sort of conclusion is we still don't know the exact mechanism that went on that day, but we still, fought the incident and found ways to patch it up. But it was specifically very tricky as an incident of just not fully understanding the mechanism and still having to deal with it. And it was one of our biggest outages in recent memory. So a bit of the past around that one is that right before that incident, well, weeks before that incident, we had multiple issues with the caching of our ingest front end. And we had regular tricks that we could use to stabilize it, slow down the deployments, make them slower, increase the size of the hosts to reduce the impact on the database and whatnot. But on that day, and this is the entire view of the day and the outage and the impact that people had, we started having that extremely spiky behavior of failing requests that were either timing out, taking too long, and just being terrible overall. And none of the things we usually did to stabilize the system worked. So all of our tools that we grew used to no longer make sense and were not working at all. And so,
Right. Hold on a second. We should back up a step and talk about what Shepherd is and why it matters for customers.
Exactly.
So what impact would customers have seen during this?
Right. Shepherd is the ingestion service that we have. So people sending us their telemetry data all goes through Shepherd. And so if Shepherd doesn't work, people don't have data to query inside Honeycomb. It's also doubling as our API gateway for people doing API queries or modifying their system, their Honeycomb implementation programmatically. So this being down is usually one of the biggest outages we can have because it means if we're not accepting data, customers are possibly dropping it on the floor and it's not coming back. And usually that's something we treat with a very, very high priority. Another interesting bits in this one is this big gap in the middle, which I'm hoping people can see my mouse cursor, where apparently for no reason, everything got really, really better for 1 hour, which we took us the time to take a break. We have no idea why it got better. We know why it stopped going better and started being wrong again. But for the most part of this incident, we were not in control of what was going on.
It's one of those frustrating things, right? Like, you press a button, it zaps you. You press a button, it zaps you. You press a button, it doesn't zap you, and you're like, what? Like, now my cognitive model of how the system works is broken.
Yes. And so if we look a bit into what this looks like at the turn of the hour from the inside, we get a bunch of alerts from our SLOs, and we have like 24-hour burn alert, but we also have 4-hour burn alerts that are paging us directly. We have triggers that also exist telling us about bad points, and within 5 minutes of it happening, we instantly are aware that something is broken, and we get all sorts of errors. And you can see like what kind of pattern it has on our error budget. Usually the yellow line is where we want to be. And you can see like a previous small outage had this tiny little effect. But this one on that day was just like busting through the entire budget of what we're supposed to be supporting.
And then
we
by
know
another
it's
factor
bad.
of 10, but
Yeah. That's the pattern we see every day, or for the entire day. And if we look back here, you see all these spikes. When you zoom in, that's what they look like. And this is latency of ingesting data, spiking up, going down, spiking up, going down, spiking up, going down. And the pattern we usually saw is that this lasts for 5 minutes and then stabilizes. But that day, for some reason, it never stabilized. And so we can see the instances rotating and eventually just going very, very bad all of a sudden. So we can look a bit about how we tried to debug that one. We loaded a bunch of queries, and we tried to break it down by all sorts of dimensions we could have. So this is a bit what it looks like when we pick like our top customers and applications and data sets and seeing like, is there any pattern to the data that they are sending us that would point out to, someone is sending us so much traffic that it's like a denial of service attack. Turns out there was nothing there. We loaded traces that looked funky, and it's like none of the things that we have instrumented are the things showing us taking time. We just have like that big delay, and for some reason it is there. And it's lasting like, those are millisecond, but this is like 80 seconds in that one. And we have like no visibility into that, even though our code is well instrumented. I think for this service, we have about 15% overhead that's just observability data being extracted from it. And that wasn't sufficient. This here is a little zoom that we have. You can see it's within like a few minutes looking at multiple spikes, and we're breaking it down by host to know if, a set of shepherd hosts or a given availability zone is having issues or something like that. And what we find is that the volume is getting really, really low. There is this banding that represents multiple hosts having lag, but there is absolutely no predictability to any of that.
One thing I want to highlight here is that it's especially valuable here that this is not aggregated data, right? That we can look at this and you can see that this is literally sub-second level granularity, whereas most metric-based tools would aggregate it to the nearest minute, not even the nearest second, right? So this kind of gave us this capability to understand, instead of, oh my goodness, latency jumped up, right? Instead, it's latency jumped up during these specific fractions of a second and resolved this fraction of a second later, right? So it kind of gives you the temporal pattern.
And this one here on the bottom right is one I like for this, because if you look at the timestamps, this is like 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. This is zooming on one of these spikes. It lasts 5 seconds roughly. And we're breaking it down in this case. You can see this, but I know because I looked into that, by pod version. So this is mid deploy. And so this is like the old version. This is the new version as a stack graph. We have the duration going up, and we have a heat map of all the connection pools used by these applications. And we can see that we have this ceiling at 25 connections per host. It's being saturated by everyone, and then it goes down. And so that's the sort of signal we have at that point. Nothing correlates to nothing. If there is any factor, it's outside of the data that we have. It has an impact on the database that we know is running hot because of cache issues, because there is a recent history of that. But there is nothing in the data that tells us exactly what is going on. And things are going to get a bit worse eventually. because this is a bit of what the architecture looks like, but we have all of our telemetry data from the Shepherd frontend is going through a single refinery instance that does sampling and aggregation and whatnot. It sends it to our own copy of Honeycomb called dog food. And that refinery process starts breaking down and crashing as well because it has too much data to process. And so we are entering this vision of the incident where a lot of our data is getting delayed, a lot of our data is getting lost. We have some very good data that tells us what the problem is not, but we also are getting a lot of false signals about services going down that are not going down at all. They're just like getting delayed because refinery is crashing under the pressure that we have right now. And at some point we're stuck in trying to figure out like maybe the problem is refinery itself crashing creates back pressure into these Shepherd instances and causes them to die. And maybe this is what we're observing. And so we're stuck in a situation of going, we just know that the database is not going swimmingly. Shepherd is going bad, refinery is going bad. Kafka seems okay, but is not super great. And we don't know what is causing what. What is it cause? Was it an effect? Is never clear and is still not super clear to this day. We get some clarity later, but only once we have fixed things. But we generally believe that this cache implementation is a problem where each Shepherd host receives data from the database, keeps a local copy, and invalidates it routinely. And every time you do a deployment, you flush all the caches and refill them. And this is like one of our early candidates. But for the entire day and the entire duration, we don't know what is going on. This is the part where it magically heals itself. And at some point here, we say like, you know what, screw this. We're not getting through it. We're rewriting parts of the cache. And we have two engineers who go in. One of them is just like diving into code and rewriting the cache. And the other one is adding a mechanism to pre-warm the cache before we start accepting traffic using metrics and statistics we have of the few previous minutes to see if it removes pressure. And the issue gets fixed at that point where the cache pre-warm gets deployed. And so we never really understood why the cache didn't work or why the pre-warm of only 10% of the most used data set is enough to stabilize the system, but it did and it never came back. And that's...
I think this is an important incident handling thing to emphasize, right? Like our goal is to resolve the incident as quickly as possible, whether that be via doing a rollback or something, right? But in this situation, what seems to have happened is that it was kind of triggered by traffic coming in. We can't just roll back our traffic. That doesn't work, right? So in that case, fixing forward was really the only feasible option when we exhausted all of the other potential config tweaking and scaling up and mitigations.
Yeah, and our usual pattern is to mitigate first, stabilize, and then do the fix cold-headed when you are not under pressure. And in that case, like we can't even stabilize the system. So, you know, we're going to do it live. And that means deploying stuff that is less tested or, you know, not as tested as you hoped it would have been with a progressive rollout. It's just like things are broken. You take a few shortcuts and they happen to be good this time. But that's a bit...
I will chime in.
Yeah.
I will chime in that as another recovering incident commander, sometimes you just have to do that, right? Like if things just aren't working and you don't know what's wrong, and just like Liz mentioned, we are trying to get back to normal. You have to do things that you haven't tested out.
It turns out just sitting there and doing nothing and scratching your head is that's just going to potentially make it continue, or not, as we saw.
Yeah.
Except for when things magically get better, apparently.
Yeah, and you know, that was one of the worst areas of concerns we had because it fixed itself and nobody did anything for it, and everyone is very concerned, like, okay, so we don't understand it and it's gone. Now we can't replicate it, we don't know what is happening, and we don't know how long it's going to last. We just pinned all the builds and hoped it would last until a day later, but it turns out that our build mechanism has a few things that are not pinnable and got deployed while we were doing experimentation and just retriggered the entire whole thing and never stabilized again. Like we had a bit of hope at that point, but it was not long-lived.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that we say as site reliability engineers, right? Hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like one once you're there. And so we eventually ended up taking the incident, having it done. Oh yeah, question here. How did we manage rotating engineers through the incident? usually these incidents are very, very short-lived, like they lasted 15 minutes, an hour, or something like that. An hour is already super long. And so the initial approach is all hands on deck. Let's fix this and go back to stability. But as it stretched in time, we ended up having people feeling very, very tired. And here it's already been like 3 or 4 hours. We took a break, got people to eat dinner or lunch or whatever happened in their time zone. But as it stretched out, we ended up having people feeling too tired to be effective, stepping out and having like a core of, I think it was the 2 engineers working on the solution there to rewrite the cache, and 2 other engineers trying to throw shit at the wall to see if it would stabilize the system. But at some point, we were like 7, 8, 9 people working on it in the early steps, and we had to step back because we had no idea how long it would last. But yeah, we had to adjust our expectations.
What's the sustainable pace? How can you make sure people are working on separate work streams and not stepping on each other's toes? And in fact, one of those things that you'll see during the incident analysis is, right, like, as field CTO, or my job title change hadn't been announced yet, right? Like, but as someone who is not part of the platform team, is not necessarily on call, right? Like, my job is mostly to get out of the way of the engineers who are doing useful things, right? Like, I can give suggestions, I can give advice, but I'm not necessarily going to be the most productive person just jumping in and kind of, putting my cowboy hat on and going, yeehaw.
Yeah, someone is asking what were the dimensions in our events that proved the most useful in the investigation. The flippant answer would be to say none of them because we didn't have any good information. In truth, all of it was useful because it let us also ignore things that didn't make sense. If it ends up being like the number of calls coming from a different host from a given application for a specific user of a different format using a given protocol, then all of these things are normal and you don't have to look there.
Yeah, it's almost as powerful to know to be able to exclude something as a hypothesis rather than, having something lead you right to the smoking gun. Sure.
Right.
I, like every other Honeycomb engineer, really, really love when Bubble Up just immediately highlights it and says, it's the AZ, or it's the user. But even when you don't have that, Fred, can you go back to the Bubble Up that we were showing? Yeah, that one, right? So kind of that A-B group comparison and then highlighting all the various dimensions, right? But in this case, it said it's evenly scattered across the AZs. It's evenly scattered across the hosts. Boop. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Right,
oh yeah, that one with the AZ.
Yeah. Yep. Right. Like, so knowing that it's something that is a traffic characteristic or a back-end characteristic can be really helpful. So honestly, the thing that helped here, I think the most in terms of our realizations, certainly one thing that we've kind of called this, right, like, is the shark fin pattern, where events start piling up and they all get reported as they finish at the same time. And then that means that, you'll have an event that started 1 second ago that has a duration of 1 second. You'll have an event that started, 500 milliseconds ago that has a duration of 500 milliseconds, right? So seeing that pattern rather than necessarily having the dimension. So I think honestly the time dimension here was the most helpful, right? The time and duration, right, that told us that we were stampeding on some kind of lock, right? That the instant that, that things got hiccuped and paused, and then
that's what you get also from knowing that it lines up with none of the other things, but it's multiple hosts, and that resource has to be shared somewhere across them because there's that point of synchronization as well. So for a long time, we're like, it has to be related to the database, but there's enough mess and dirt and layers to this thing that it isn't all cut clear and dry. But it is very, very informative, even though if it doesn't give you the answer, because you eliminate so many opportunities of investigations leading nowhere.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing is when you think about the systems diagram, when you think about kind of how all the pieces of your service fit together, right? Kind of having that broader service map and kind of honing, right? Honeycomb is never going to be a tool that kind of, or rarely is going to be the tool that leads you directly to the answer, right? It's kind of more, how can we help improve our understanding of the system, improve our understanding of causality of what causes what, of forming and confirming hypotheses.
And I think that's something that, like, philosophically, Honeycomb and Jeli have in common, that we believe that engineers are the best prepared to engineer.
Yeah. And speaking of Jeli, we ended up ingesting the data there to have the investigation. And Jeli has this first approach where you have all your comments and all the channels we were using at the time ingested, and I'm the one who did the analysis of this one. And the first step is really similar to I forget the name of the analysis type that is coming from humanities when you are doing this in-depth search of surfacing themes. And so you just go through all the logs and you put a bunch of annotations about that to see like what stands out in this incident. And there are a bunch of fairly obvious themes and patterns that came up and that were already there. But there's a big preparation step that we treat as optional for people who are not super deep incident nerds that I like doing, because that's the one that gives a bunch of insights and lets us create that structure. And once this is done, then we end up creating the big timeline that we use for the incidents.
Speaking of which, we should talk about the source data, right? Like, we haven't yet talked about how we kind of use chat ops at Honeycomb, right? Like, so the Jeli bot sits in our channels, right? Like, or, you know, we spawn per incident channels, and that allows us to have these conversations in the same way we would normally, right? Like, have conversations among each other as colleagues. Sometimes it is necessary to fork off a separate Zoom call, right? But most of the time we are pasting Honeycomb links into chat, or like, you know, talking in individual threads or just in the chat room in general, as we try to kind of grapple with and figure out what's going on.
Right. We're very distributed, and there's even that message here of, you know, it looks like dog food refinery is also suffering, and someone posting the metrics. And the pattern we'll see in Slack is someone is going to post a graph, and if it's in any way interesting, people are going to start a sub-thread in it where they just like re-enrich that vision and post more variations of it, or things that come from a different data set or a different service, and saying like, hey, I think this is right. No, it points in the wrong direction. Actually, something like that. And you have that social enrichment of the mental model of the incident. And when something good is attained that looks plausible, then someone reposts it to the main incident channel or ops or whatever, to go like, hey, we think we have something here and we need to do something about it. But there's that very social step of debugging, understanding, and bringing data until we get something a bit more solid.
Kind of like communal recognition or like crowdsourcing, like what stands out, how can we cut this to help give us more information, and kind of using every individual's context to come together and join together to be able to find the thing that's going to be more relevant. Yeah.
And in some of our hairiest incidents or near misses, often we end up having investigations where you find out that no one has the full answer, and that if you didn't have that collaboration of different people putting different perspectives, no one would have had the full picture. Someone has the expertise about a bit of change in the system that nobody else has. And I think it has happened to me like at least 5 or 6 times in the last year, of just going like, I had no idea, but I feel like I contributed something that nobody else could, and that other people have the same sort of feeling, that they have bits of context, and it's like making a puzzle and everyone has a piece and it's never complete without all the pieces.
It's not just getting all of the stuff together though, right? Like, I think it's also figuring out what is important after the fact. Something may seem very important during, and then it turns out to not be important. Or conversely, something may just fly under the radar. Someone may make an offhand suggestion, you know, no one acts on it, and then we realized several hours later that that was actually the key to solving it, right? Like, you only find that out by looking in hindsight, you know. And of course, you shouldn't be like, you know, oh my God, you know, we're going to totally exercise your hindsight bias and say, you know, how dare we ignore that person, right? Like, you know, they had the right idea, but it's like, no, right? Like, you know, we were busy, we missed it, right? Like, it happens.
What made it so obvious for that person but not intuitive to anyone else? And that's where a lot of your investigation can go to highlight very interesting pattern about your organization.
And it's also really interesting to look at those things that we rabbit holed on, the red herrings, the stuff that were like, oh, it's got to be this, and a bunch of people swarmed around, and we kind of made circles to understand like why was this appealing to us? Why did we think we could find something in here? Is this like something that we can really figure out, break apart, or is this just, yep, there was a red herring and we can move past it, like whether those are learning opportunities or not?
Right. In a timeline view like this is often where the gaps are, which is just like people had a bunch of hypotheses, they're testing them, and during that time, there is nothing being reported that's significant, like what is going on in that time. That's where a lot of the cognitive work is taking place. Maybe not in that one, because that's the time we took a break. Because everything was stable. But in a lot of them, the little gaps is where you go drive an interview with someone and ask, like, what were you looking at this time? What felt significant? Or what were the things you were entertaining? Because that period of time where nothing is being reported, people are thinking hard.
Thinking hard, or maybe they're on a Zoom call or something, right? Like that does happen.
That too.
We try to report back what happened in the Zoom in text format just for posterity, as well as for other people who weren't in that Zoom at the same time. Because if you are, being tagged into an incident and you want to be able to find out what's happened before, the info that happened on a private Zoom call, that's not going to be accessible to you. So you kind of have to make sure you're doing those readouts consistently.
Right. And at some point we assemble all these tags and we build what is the narrative view in Jeli, and I'm sure our Jeli folks on the call can tell us more about. But by this point, we have usually identified a few themes. Like in this case, there was a messy amplification loop around the errors and refinery. Part of it is just like how tired people are, especially like just calling out, we don't know what is going on and this is worse as an incident. And just for good sake, what we don't see on the right here is that the day after we had another like 5 or 6 hours outage for something entirely different, but that we knew how to handle. And everyone like this is easy compared to yesterday. It's a lot worse sometimes in terms of impact, but we know what's going on. This is like vacation by comparison. And the third one was just like the challenges around the cache and whatnot. So we start building that timeline to do a meeting and talk to everyone in the organization with.
This is, or go ahead, V.
Oh, no, similar to just jumping off what Fred said, we are huge believers in narrative timeline here at Jeli. We believe that storytelling is how people learn. Communicating, sharing, communication, collaboration, all of that takes part of incidents. And so being able to create a visual narrative timeline really helps when you're trying to actually learn from incidents. Being able to see that an incident is not just detection, diagnosis, repair, right? It's not just like we got this alert, we reverted the change and we're back to normal. It's a lot of like going back and forth, finding new things and from your observability platforms, talking to people. And then you have your key moments, right? Oh shoot, everything got better. Oh shoot, no, that was all just fake. And so being able to see that, it helps a lot. And I'm sure you'll talk more about the meeting, the postmortem. It's usually like the meat of what people think of postmortems. But having that visual timeline, I found really helps turn that from just a one-person show leading a postmortem, filling out a template, into just a collaborative conversation where you can actually learn.
And I feel like it too is the closest that I've ever gotten in like an incident timeline to actually representing what it was like in the incident, what response actually went through in order to solve the problems that they were encountering, that it wasn't just like, yep, we investigated and then we identified what was going on and then we fixed it. And isn't that amazing that there is like this nuance of going back and forth, trying things, experimenting, and then realizing, okay, that's not it. Like we have to go back to something else, or we're working together to kind of like crowdsource those ideas, trying hypotheses, and like making, look, the repair line, there's like half a dozen, almost a dozen things on that repair line of things that were tried that it's worth talking about and worth mentioning beyond just like, yeah, we tried some stuff that didn't work. It's that nuance. And exactly what Fred was saying is everyone's experience in this incident, doing all of these troubleshootings, throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what would fix, made the next incident that you had the next day feel like a piece of cake, because you're like, okay, my muscles are warmed up, I'm ready to go, and I have ideas and I'm primed. And that's like one of the biggest pieces of learning from incidents that we can do, is just gaining that context and gaining some new skills of recognizing and trying things.
And
Before
that's why I
we move
think
on to talking about our retrospective meeting and stuff, since we're on the subject, TTR metrics, like what is your take on them? Because like so many people, talk about mean time to recovery, mean time to detection, right? Like we're talking about the richness here. Like why is it that those things are a problem, or are they a problem?
How much time do we have to?
We've got time.
I think that they lack so much context. I think that you can use mean time to whatever, but it really doesn't give you an accurate picture of what actually happened and the nuance of why it took us to get so long to resolution, or that the resolution part, getting to resolution wasn't actually the hard part of the incident. The part of the incident that we were struggling with was finding the right people who had the right context to be able to help us with. It's really just showcasing one tiny part of what occurs and how response actually works and all of the ebbs and flows of it, that it kind of just, I could say it takes me 5 minutes to get to my front door, and every time I get to my front door I'm trying to get that down just a little bit lower, but sometimes there is an elderly bulldog and 3 cats in the hallway, and that my time to the front door is going to be longer because I have to stop and pet somebody, or I have to make sure I don't trip over the cat, and that's the same incident, the same amount of space. It should be taking me only 5 minutes, but that nuance isn't represented without the context of how we actually got through the incident. So it's nice to have metrics. I think that we all like having numbers that say that things are good or that we're getting better at things, but they don't actually reflect the real work that's going into response.
I think not only that, but often we are lumping in these metrics, we're lumping in incidents that have nothing to do with each other, right? You have your incidents where Emily needs to get from her code to the front door, but then you also have your incidents where Vanessa needs to get from here to the train. And those are completely different incidents. And then just as Emily said, it's not taking into account the context of what's going on. If I take a look at this incident and it lasted hours, and Fred mentioned that most of your incidents last maybe 15 minutes. It's not that y'all weren't doing your jobs during this incident. I'm sure you guys were working extremely hard during this. But that's just the different beast that was this incident. It's completely different, and it doesn't make sense to compare those two.
Yeah, you can game and improve your MPTR if it has an always common element in all the incidents, and you could be doing something like even doing a rollback requires a new build, and a new build takes 24 hours. And so yeah, your MTTR is going to be really easy to improve by improving your deployment mechanism. But at some point, once you have optimized enough of these things, the noise of the incident takes over anything else that you would do, and the metric becomes meaningless. It is a good starter metric when you have almost nothing, but once you reach a certain point of sophistication, it loses all signal value, and everything else is only found in the incident data and not in the aggregate view that you would have with it.
That's
almost
a
like
lot
we're
of
seeing
what
some parallels between observability, rich data and just pre-aggregated metrics, and incident data and pre-aggregated incident metrics, right? There are a lot of kind of parallels here about how having access to that raw data really, really can help you get better insights.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Liz. The data itself is not bad. The metric, knowing how long an incident lasted, is not bad on its own. If you give it to an engineer, if you give it to an expert who knows what they're looking at and is able to give you the context and is able to give you recommendations, that makes a difference. But the numbers themselves on their own don't really mean anything.
If the incident is long enough, it tells you need to take a bit more time off, maybe.
Yeah, you sleep in longer.
Speaking of diving into the details, let's go ahead and talk about the diving into the details.
Right. When we do the sort of review we have here with this map, this is what people coming in the incident review see usually. I will personally share that same screen, but I have this picture in my mind instead, which is I know the big phases of the incident, and I have this mapping in my mind of what happened with the big things and what the big events were for each of these. And I already know that stuff. Because I've done the analysis. And what I do is I reach out to a bunch of people, and this is in the same guidelines that Jeli is publishing in the How We Guide, if I'm asking Liz for information or Vanessa for information, and I know I want them to be part of the discussion because they were involved in the incident, I tell them ahead of time, like, I'm going to talk about this bit. When we tried, scaling Shepherd to be bigger vertically so we have fewer instances, and I want you, if you're comfortable with it, to tell us about that. So I'm going to give the timeline, and I'm going to drive through these elements, and once we are there, it's like, okay, Emily, you were trying to size them up. So what was the thing you were trying to accomplish? What were the signals you were looking for? And I'm trying to make it a conversation with people in there. And even when we have people going like, in hindsight, like, hey, the fix was obvious, you just had to do this. I'm going to usually ask that person to tell me about that, but also ask the person who didn't know about the information why they thought what they were doing was significant. And the contrast between what one person was thinking and the other was thinking highlights these differences in the mental models they have, and that becomes a learning experience of comparing and contrasting the different viewpoints of people within the system. And essentially, we run the meeting like that, and at the end, we're done, and people have a bunch of ideas or feel like they have a better understanding of the system or what went on and what was challenging.
Ooh, I really wish that we could have the honeycomb SLO graph overlaid with Jeli just like that, just like you've done on that slide. Like, that's beautiful, Fred. Like, being able to see how impacted were customers, like, from a scale from 0 to 100 during the course of the incident, right? As we're also tagging these aha moments and people, coming up with diagnoses. God, that's beautiful.
We've got some real cool things coming up, Liz.
I think the other interesting thing is here, the question that Edward had of, like, why is there such a big gap on your Jeli timeline, right? Like, shouldn't the incident be done and wrapped up and over?
I don't.
Right, like, Fred, what's up with that kind of overnight when no one did anything?
That gap overnight, it's only that when I did the incident review, like, there's, as I mentioned, there's a pattern of a few weeks before, and there's also a cleanup pattern of a few days after. And getting the full significance is, it's a sort of editorial choice you do when running the review. But for that one of the things that's interesting of going is, like, at this point we have stabilized most of the system, but refinery is still, like, overly dropping data. And we keep getting, like, dozens of alerts, non-paging alerts every hour about services not running when they should. And we somewhat knew that this was just because, refinery was tweaked the hell out just to shut up and stop crashing. And so for that entire time, there's a period where we made the choice of saying the system is stable enough that we're going to clean it up tomorrow, go to sleep. And I believed as an analyst of the incident that this was a very important decision worth discussing. And so this is the part where we do a lot of work. This is the part where we rest and where we do the little cleanups in the morning and figure out the few bits that we're missing. And it's also interesting for me to call out that then we get into another incident. Like, that's part of the pattern of incident response. If we're considering how tired people were, because that was one of the themes that came up, then I want to discuss the decision making of when do we feel the system is stable enough to move on and do something else, and what else can happen to impact that, because those were the important things I thought we should talk about after looking at the data. So that's why the gap is here. That's a choice.
A couple of things you can take away to your organization here is, not everything is of equal importance, right? Like, again, if you're not under pressure to close the incident as quickly as possible, you shouldn't, be like, oh my God, like, I have to finish this off, and even though I'm really tired and I'm making mistakes just for the sake of closing the incident, right? Definitely, like, a close wait or monitoring state is appropriate for that. If you have cleanup you need to do that's non-urgent. If you're in a global organization, sure, you can hand it off to the next on-call, but you also might want to ask that question of, is it really worth the cognitive overhead of doing a handoff versus letting it sit for 12 hours? Or maybe you do a partial handoff, right? You say, here's what to do if it comes back, but also I promise I'll clean this up when I wake up next. Like, don't worry about it unless it comes back, right? So for instance, we are now a little bit more of a global organization with employees in the UK and Australia, and, in addition to Canada and the US. But at the time, I think when this happened, I was in Canada, right? There kind of wasn't the possibility of handing this off after everyone was going to bed. Like, we can hand things off from East Coast to West Coast of North America, but that's about it as far as kind of at a certain point, everyone will hit a wall. And at that point, either you let things drop, or you're literally talking about, waking someone up or like bringing someone fresh in and asking them to stay up late.
And I think this is a great example of how learning from incidents can help you drive your staffing. You can realize maybe we're having a lot of incidents where folks have to continue working or stop. Maybe we need to focus on a more follow the sun environment. And so learning from incidents can help you not only make your systems, your technical systems stronger, but also your staffing, your organization, how all of that works.
Right. And part of it is also surfacing the things, even if we don't change the staffing, of given the current staffing, here are decisions that are important to make, of saying like, hey, we are 7 people right now. If this goes on long, we can't be that many. So 3 or 4 of you have to get out, even if it makes things a bit more difficult right now, because it's more sustainable in the long run. And we have to start thinking about these things.
Yeah, we have absolutely, if we've known that an incident is going to be big, right? Like, for instance, once a year, just about, there will be a global, or there will be a regional outage of US East 1 in some capacity. We now know when that happens, send half of the team to bed early, like send the East Coasters to bed, like, they don't have to stay up late. We know we're going to need them in 6 hours.
And you're able to make that call because you're able to look retroactively at your incidents and try to see how you do your work. That's really awesome.
And part of it, I think, is also coming from the organization trusting its engineers to make some of these calls. Like, we don't have hard and fast rules about this is a P whatever, this is the level of response you need to have with this many hands on decks. Every incident is sort of unique, and we sort of go like, the way this is looking, we make it to this point, and then we call it off, and we revisit later. And we are allowed and encouraged to make that sort of decision. And so the incident review being based on learning then is transferring a lot of that experience and judgment to other people so they can also make good decisions in future incidents.
Right. This shouldn't necessarily be, Liz was on call the last time AWS broke, and therefore, if Liz isn't on call, like she's going to, the next person on call is not going to make the same decisions, right? Like, these incident reviews are our mechanism of kind of communicating that institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
That's why talking about like the incident review, I think so much within the industry, has been focused on solving the technical problems, unlocking like all of the different bugs and finding action items for stuff. But so much of the value is just sharing this context and this knowledge so that we're armed with more information the next time we are trying to solve a problem that we can't figure out easily, especially talking about the response pieces of building in that like institutional cultural part of responding to incidents of we have to take care of ourselves so that we can continue to take care of the system. So we have to make these calls and prioritize like, okay, it's getting really late. We've been on this for 6 hours. We need to cut staff or we need people to go to sleep.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that made us go towards Jeli as a tool as well, is that many incident review tools are things I like to call action item factories, where you go in a meeting and you go fill in the blanks of the template until you have the tickets everyone knew they would put in before the meeting, and then you're done. And you just like race through them as a procedure. And
then no one actually does any of the action items, of course, right? Because there's no understanding of, what's important.
Right. And this sort of slower analysis approach prevents we need to provide a bit more training to people doing the incident reviews, but it prevents you from not thinking at all about your incident. You have to sort of give it the structure yourself, have the discussion. And usually by the time we're having this meeting, most of the remediations, the critical ones that are obvious and high priority, are already done and deployed. And so we are there to learn, and maybe there are a few insights that are going to come up, like, hey, this is the 3rd time we see this sort of pattern. Maybe we need to change the approach we have to something. But generating the idea is entirely different from having the fix done really, really rapidly. And someone asked if we time cap our incident review meetings. Yes, we try to stick within 1 hour to cover the entire thing. And what that means is that when we do the analysis and the choice of themes that we have, like I named 3 of them earlier, we are very careful about dropping some of them or picking the most critical ones. And we know that, this incident is going to be about that aspect. And if we have to see another aspect of how we respond, it's going to be done in a different incident or in a long written report instead that's going to have the time to cover it. But we are trying to maximize the time here.
Yeah, there are ways for people to asynchronously contribute without kind of using the synchronous time that we value most critically for kind of having the high bandwidth conversations. Yeah, I think the theme that I'm pulling out from this is the artifact that we're producing is kind of the shared knowledge and shared state, right? The artifact is not the action items. The artifact is not, hey, we decreased time to resolve by X%.
Yeah, and I think we don't even track the action. Yeah, we don't track the action items. Not in this place, at the very least.
You can.
We can.
You can. I think it's fair to say that any self-respecting engineer would take care of the bugs even before you have the retrospective meeting. And if the artifact is the learning will drive to a stronger, more resilient technology stack. So again, trust your engineers.
Right. I think you will need to track the action items if your process to picking priorities and the work to do is completely hermetic and decided top-down. And so the incident becomes the mechanism by which you alter the roadmap. But if your engineers already have the ability of influencing the work they do and impacting it, then yeah, you won't need to track anything because that's already happening. I think, yeah, we are at the question times. I think the analysis bit we probably can skip at this point in time.
Yeah, we've kind of done a nice job here. I think
did.
the one thing I do want to highlight here is, you did briefly pull up the public incident report versus the internal Jeli report, right? Like, how do we think about when we're doing analysis, what goes to which audience? I think that's the main thing that I'd like to pull out for to talk about when we talk about analysis. Like, there are different audiences.
Right, there's different audiences, and I have this public report that's the long form that's 12 pages. That one I think is 3,000 words at the most, which is much shorter. And before writing this, I have an internal review that's something like 20 pages. That's all the details and the internal components that were significant to us at the time. So rather than just going there's going to be links to the cache, to all the things, the implementation, some of the more direct comments of people. But when we write the one that goes to be public, then I start reframing the question about what do I want the reader to come away with this. And so it gets to be a step more abstract about what it is to manage these services, because you're not operating Shepherd like us, but maybe you have a service that has a cache, so what is common. And when I step out and do the short version for the blog, that's even shorter, and I have to drop all the details and go with what is the absolute core important thing that I have in there. And that's the hardest one to write because it's shedding all these things that I think are super interesting and important, but it needs to fit within the time. And so each one of them has a slightly different audience. The thing I try to do in all of them is to remain, I don't want to say impartial or factual, is I want to remain, only report things that people stated and happened, and not necessarily have the stance of telling people what is important to remember. I show facts. I make the room for people to have their own learnings if possible. And the other one is, this isn't a public apology. This isn't a PR exercise. I'm here to explain what happened, what we tried, and why it was challenging, if it was at all. And the rest will sort of take care of itself, which is a lot harder to do in organizations that don't let you do that, because I don't know, legal goes over every single incident review.
Yeah, it's kind of this thing of other organizations may use incident reports as kind of cover your rear exercises of, we have to produce this for our most important customers, or, oh my God, you can't disclose that, people will think that we're incompetent at our jobs, right? Like, fortunately at Honeycomb, we have the luxury of being able to be fully transparent with our customers and with the broader public, because we want you all to be able to learn from our instance the same way we do, and we trust that you'll form the correct beliefs about whether we're competent at our jobs. I like to think that we are, but I think we put the facts out there so you can figure it out.
We're a bit lucky that a lot of our customers are also engineers. It would be a bit trickier if a lot of our customers were dentists or something, which you don't share the same reality, and you have to do a lot more explaining, I guess.
I think like it's fair to say that Oh, I think it's fair to say that different audiences require different communication styles. I've had to send information along to people who are not technical at all, who I know care more about the impact, how it's impacting our customers, how it's impacting our users. And so the information that I share with them is definitely going to be different than the information that I share to engineers. And for anything that needs to go out to the public, if it needs to be a PR exercise, then I would want to partner with somebody who is a PR professional, not myself, because I'm an engineer.
And being able
right,
to
well,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Emily.
I just say being able to take that really like broad, incredibly detailed swath of information that you get from doing that analysis of discovery, it becomes easier to like summarize things and make things more customer facing because you have the context and you have that understanding. The underlying understanding is really hard to get sometimes. So being able to build that knowledge for the folks who are even writing the public relations releases, they're going to be able to speak to it better and really reassure customers in a more complete way by having that knowledge.
We have a
All right,
question
well,
about.
before we get to the questions, like let's take the questions later. I do have a bit of housekeeping I need to cover.
Yeah.
So we covered a bunch of really great stuff in incidents today. So like the person who just asked the question, please drop any questions that you have in the chat and we'll try to get to any that we can in the next 5 minutes. While questions are coming in, we definitely value your feedback and we'd love to have you complete a survey about this session in the next 23 hours before tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific. And if you do fill out that survey, we'll send you a t-shirt to say thanks if you're in one of the countries that we can ship to. Bethany has dropped the link into the chat, or you can scan the QR code on your screen. So the secret word is incident for filling out the form. All right, Boop, let's go ahead and take some questions. So
Yes.
Fred, you were just reading the question about incident report.
Yeah, if you have an incident report ready SLA for external customers, what are some ways to ensure that we still get max insights from the incident? And what I've seen, and folks on the call can maybe add to that, is that a lot of these contractually obligated things ask you to have like a full root cause analysis within 2 days or something like that, which, you know, by definition tells you it has to be a shallow analysis that's not going to be super useful. And what I've seen companies do, and that we started doing when we had such of these reports, is you give them a different name. And I've seen, I think Slack does it. They just like published root cause analysis. It's a 1-pager done right after the incident. But 3-4 weeks later, you get like the in-depth incident analysis comes up, and it's out of band, done in a blog post or something for people who actually want to learn from the incident and not just to fulfill a contractual obligation. And so sometimes on our status page, when it's something a bit big that we know customers wanted to get quick feedback on, we have what we call the preliminary report. And there's an indication in there, like a full in-depth analysis is going to come later. But you want to give people some information early with a caveat that it's not fully accurate, and then do the full thing in due time, because doing a good analysis requires time. And if you have an SLA, it's essentially putting a cap on the quality of what you're going to ship in terms of a review.
Yeah, I think it boils down to, you know, you can state key facts. You can definitely summarize things that went out as incident communications during the incident. That's actually something we haven't touched on, is we really involve our customer success team. In fact, we've had members of our sales team as well volunteer to act as the communications lead during incidents, right? Like, so those are the folks who are formulating things for an external audience during the incident itself, and kind of doing so, you know, saying, here's where we are, here's what we know, right? Like, so that kind of helps us pull that that shorter thing together that is kind of a customer-facing communication faster.
Emily and Vanessa, point of view on that one?
I mean, I've played a lot of that SLA game of yes, we have to hit these SLAs for customer communications, and I think you nailed it. It's preliminary findings and saying, like, this is the information that we have right now about the incident, about what you experienced and how it connected with what we were working on during the incident, and then open the door for, and we're going to do a more in-depth analysis here, and we will provide more context and information once we have completed that analysis. Because it's, I mean, the SLA isn't that it has to be the most in-depth thing. And I think a lot of times the kind of war internally for the priority gets put on that findings SLA that is sent out to customers. But really it's kind of something you can summarize and put out, where the actual priority and focus can be on doing that analysis and gaining that context internally.
Do we have a bit of time
All right,
for the
one
extra
last question? Yeah,
Yeah.
one last question.
Yeah, we have someone asking, if you have time, I'd love to hear about how you gather a sync incident review material and what is done synchronously. I think this is a great question for the Jeli folks behind the hallway guide, though. So
I think every organization is different. You can do the whole thing asynchronously if that's the kind of the culture that you have. Jeli allows for collaboration. We really want to see and hear everybody's point of view. So actually, if you have a Jeli license, everybody has access to Jeli. We don't price per seat. So that's definitely part of it. I personally like doing a live retrospective meeting. So that's something that you want to do synchronously, but everything else, I think the tagging, the narrative, that can be done asynchronously.
I find it's one of those things that's, really good to tidy up as you go along, right? If you know something is like a light bulb moment, right? Like tag it with a Slack emoji, right? Like that way it'll be easier to find. That way someone is not, trying to find it, a couple days later.
I also kind of have the kind of built-in thing in my brain is during the incident, if we are doing synchronous communication, if we're hopping on a call, hopping on a Zoom, because it's going to be faster and easier for us, I have that like, okay, we're making this easier, but that means I also have to summarize a little bit of what's going on for me later, but also for whoever's not on this call right now, to make that synchronous conversation that's giving us the ability to, get on the same page faster, not something that's going to be kind of a hard thing to get over, a hard thing to know what happened. There's a big gap in the time of what was being communicated. I don't understand these things, is kind of like the trade-offs, right? We can go faster here, but I also am going to be summarizing what's going on for everybody else.
And even when it comes to after the incident in a review, at some point you can get synchronous face-to-face talking to someone in an interview. And with a few of the colleagues I have who ran the interviews are like, I was gathering all the data, it felt really, really sort of vague, but when I talked to these key people and just let them tell me what they thought was significant, I instantly knew what the incident review needed to be about. They had good information. And, that's face-to-face, asynchronous after the fact, but that turns out to be absolutely critical information that we tend to sort of easily drop because it's not as obviously available and you are time constrained, so you just like gather the logs and run the thing. But talking to people directly and getting their impression gives you a lot of information as well.
Excellent. Well, we could certainly go on for hours about this. We're such big incident nerds here. But that's all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's presentation. Remember that a link to watch the session on demand will be in your inbox soon. And you can feel free to share that session with your colleagues if you liked that content. We've got some great events coming up. Check those out. I've dropped the links into the chat. You can find more webinars and other helpful content at honeycomb.io in our resource library. Thank you for joining us and have a happy week, everyone.